episode, we hear from Paula Cordeiro, Dammeyer Distinguished Professor of Global Leadership and Education at the University of San Diego. Paula served as president of UCEA from 1997 to 1998. Paula's roles as an educator have been numerous, from teacher to school leader to dean. She's also made groundbreaking contributions in the foundation and nonprofit sectors. These vast and varied experiences have taken her around the world, leaving a lasting impact on educational leadership and preparation along the way. Her unique interdisciplinary research interests include social entrepreneurship, women in leadership, philanthropy, and international educational development. We have so much to learn from her global perspective. How has the field expanded to include and embrace international perspectives? What might a truly global future look like, both for UCEA and the field? Listen to find out. Paula, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to In the Lead with UCEA.
Monica, thank you. It's great to be here with you and to be talking about a topic I am passionate about. Thank you.
Absolutely. So much of your like your own trajectory it has impacted the way that I think about things. So thank you for that. Let's get to it. And my first question is really around, you bring a really valuable global perspective to the field and to UCEA. During your time as a member of UCEA and as a part of the leadership of UCEA, how has the field expanded internationally?
Sure. So I'm going to have to situate the field first, Monica.
Yes.
So UCEA, let's go to the last century. So the last 50 years, the second half of the last century, UCEA is founded. 1950s, 1960s, it gets traction. Prior to that, it was individual professors that were meeting, but it wasn't until UCEA that you have open to departments. So who were those professors in the 60s, 70s, 80s until the 90s? They were primarily white, male, and they had specialties. So, for example, in 1990, I joined UConn, and they were a member of UCEA. I was the first woman in that department of 18 faculty. I was the only non-tenured faculty member. And I was the only person who wasn't a specialist. These people were finance or law, policy. And they were geared toward, in Connecticut, the state of Connecticut. And the same thing was happening in Ohio or Florida or California, looking at education policy, education law within those states. So, where did, I was interested in international issues, but there was no place for me to have those conversations within my department or even in my teaching, it was real limited. So UCEA was the place. And so I go to my first meeting and I start meeting people like Steve Jacobson. So Steve was involved with something that UCEA did way on in the early 60s and continued until the 1990s. It was called, and I never participated in it, always wanted to, the IIP, maybe you've heard of that?
Yep.
Yeah, the International Intervisitation Program. Canadian universities, the UCEA had a few Canadian universities as members. They would go to that. Couple of people like the Steves who had international interests. As a new professor at UConn, there were no support for me to do that. I couldn't create a rationale. Why should I go to Barbados to look at their educational system when I was?
Why not?
And that was part of the challenge in the beginning. People thought you wanted to go to these other countries as a tourist and go on vacation. And that was never about, for those of us in the early years. So Steve Jacobson, I would hang out a bit with him. I'd also hang out with Paul Bredesen. Paul was interested in Sweden, had colleagues in Sweden that he worked with. And then Malu Gonzalez. Malu, being in a border state, she had grant monies from Mexico basically for teachers, because Mexico didn't have at that time preparation programs for school leaders. So she was doing some of that work. So those were the people that I hung out with in the early years. And UCEA, when I became president, I felt so fortunate because I was invited by the president of an international association, Commonwealth Council for Educational Administration and Management, CCEAM. Angela Thode invited me to go to their meeting, and she honored me with a fellowship there because I was trying to get UCEA to collaborate on programming with CCEAM. So the infrastructure wasn't there with the exception of IIP, and it was only faculty with individual interests in the last century. And it wasn't until UCEA created the International Center, the initiative that Bruce Barnett was running. He went to the Belmas, the British Educational Leadership Conference, formed a group there of people who were interested in collaborating and doing research. So all of that, and the other thing that was happening at that time, and why UCEA was what UCEA was trying to do was so important, was states in the late 80s, 90s, turn of the century, were really changing their credentialing systems. That's when the standards were coming out. And in those early standards, whether they were state level or national, there wasn't a lot of international in there. Language, culture, diversity in the first iterations. So even then, we didn't have the infrastructure support. So organizations like UCEA became crucial to folks like me to be able to present my research.
Wow, that's a great story. I'm not sure I've ever quite heard it that way. And I guess maybe sort of as a follow-up to that, where do you see, or how have you seen sort of the pockets of sort of knowledge generation evolving over time? So clearly in Sweden and Canada, I know UCA used to have relationships with Australia, and sort of what was driving that, and at what point did it sort of become organizational as opposed to just individual?
Yeah. So sometime in the 70s, a professor in Australia by the name of Bill Walker, he's Alan Walker's father.
Oh my
Alan,
goodness. Okay.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
So he was in charge of the secretariat for the creation of CCEAM, the Commonwealth Council. I didn't know him, but I heard lots of stories about him. So Bill started, started attending meetings. Other professors in Australia were getting involved. The Australian government started looking at preparation programs. So the Commonwealth nations, so the UK with the National Leadership College, the UK, Canada, Australia in particular were the places that were where professors were gravitating toward. At the same time, and part of the challenge with UCEA, to be, as you very well know, to be a UCEA member, unless it's changed, you have to have a doctoral program.
Right.
So there are so many preparation programs in the United States, around the world, that don't have doctoral programs. So the National Association of Professors of Educational Administration, which has morphed into the International Council for Professors of Ed Admin, that group was also out there, and some of us were involved with that organization as well. In particular, people who were looking at indigenous perspectives in the United States of leadership. Some of them were coming out of NCPEA. So it really wasn't until more of our universities started to add doctoral programs, become members. We were, I'm at the University of San Diego now. When I got to USD, we were not a member of UCEA, and it was my goal to make us a member. So we had been engaged a little bit with attending the meetings, but when you're not a member, it's not as exciting to go to the
Oh yeah,
sessions
governance. Woohoo.
and serve on the committees and do
Right.
that important work. So so what's happened, and if I can take it forward one more step,
Uh-huh.
the Millennium Development Goals. So I
Mm,
remember being at a UCEA meeting talking about them. It was like 2001, 2002.
mm.
Hardly anybody even knew what I was
Knew
talking
about them, yeah.
and couldn't understand why. And then when I really explored it, it was because the US was not involved with the development of the Millennium Development Goals. They were
Mm,
really targeting low and middle income countries.
right.
So even when I was at a British university or an Australian university or wherever in France, I didn't hear at that time about the
Mm,
MDGs. As soon as the Sustainable Development Goals were talked about, so that's 2011,
right.
2012, 13, that's when the US became involved with
Mhm.
those goals. So it set the stage. So you have now the creation of the SDGs, the UK, Australia, Hong Kong having really strong programs. Phil, Phil Hallinger, I
Mm,
remember this distinctly. It was the late 1990s. Hallinger said to me, "Yeah, I'm going to Thailand." And I said, "Well, how can you possibly be a professor at Vanderbilt and also be a professor at Chulalongkorn University in Thailand?"
mhm.
And he did it. And that was the day that I said to myself, I don't have to make my international interests tangential. I can
Mm,
put them in the core of my work because
mhm.
other professors are doing it. And by the way, I have to add, Vanderbilt's a private university.
Right.
UConn public. It was harder. I get to
Mm,
USD, it's a lot easier to do it
right.
in the privates. It just is because we tend
Right.
to have more, we tend to be smaller with interdisciplinary work
Right.
being supported and incentivized.
Yeah. That's
So
a
all of
that's a
that,
conversation for that's like that's a conversation for a whole other podcast.
yes, yes, it is.
um, Sort of thinking about, the development of a knowledge base or thinking about leadership frameworks. And so much of our work, as you're suggesting, is sort of inward, right? Like what's happening in the U.S., what's happening in our states in particular, in terms of what is what preparation looks like and what it means. What How do you think those our understanding of leadership is beginning or has evolved because of what's happened outside of the U.S.?
Yeah, well, part of what happened first, I think, was teacher education and the
Mm,
changes that took place in the teacher education credentialing. Because all of a sudden, it's not only urban districts that have an influx of migrant children, refugee children, children speaking all these other languages. Now you have all over America in rural areas. So we have to have teachers who are prepared.
mm,
Then we have to have school leaders who
mm,
understand issues of language and culture, and that bilingualism is a good thing, multilingualism is a good thing. So that's taking place. Then the Millennium Development Goals morph into the SDGs,
mm,
and internationally, you have colleagues in other countries who are now looking at the research that's being done in the United States, saying how it is relevant or maybe not. You have I think the national college work that came out of the UK. A
mhm.
lot of
Yeah, yeah.
people from the US were involved in that.
Mhm.
So all of those were important to the knowledge base. But here's part of always been part of my concern.
Mhm.
So when I have many of my colleagues, that some of them I mentioned, some of them I haven't yet mentioned, but they have been consultants in these
Mhm.
other nations to those preparation programs to the government ministries, etc. I personally have had a little bit of difficulty with that. Part of it,
Speak,
well,
Paula.
yeah, well, the reality of it is, I was
Yeah.
asked to go into Ghana and do work for a large international NGO in the education space. And they said to me, yeah, we have to train teachers. So, would you go in and tell me what your university can do to train those teachers? And I spent 2 weeks there, 2 weeks of my vacation time, visiting schools, interviewing people. I took a small team with me. And that wasn't what they needed, teacher education. They needed leadership education. But what kind of leadership education did they need? I didn't even understand their system of education. So these outside consultants, I remember walking with one of our esteemed colleagues, and we were walking one time in Malaysia and visiting a school. And I asked him, I said, gee, you've probably visited all kinds of schools in Malaysia, because he was giving a talk about education and what Malaysia should do. And this was his first visit to a school.
Oh.
So we need to understand, if we're going to be learning with our colleagues from these other nations, these children are entering our systems as well. And so this is what I always say to my students, and I believe this really strongly, that a person who knows only one educational system knows no educational system. And it's when you're visiting schools, engaging in deep conversations with educators and policymakers in those nations, where you're exploring different practices. I learned about the practice of looping teachers in grades when I lived and worked in Venezuela. I thought it was so strange that a teacher, an elementary school teacher, moved from first to second to third grade with her students and then would rotate back. When I came back to the US and talked about that, people were like, what are you talking about? That's absurd. Well, fast forward, lots of school districts have adopted looping policies. Some of John Hattie's work looked at the impact of looping policies.
Right.
So what is the knowledge base? And
Right. Well, I think you highlighted a tension I know that I feel, but that also exists, broadly in the field, right? In the sense that, it's not surprising when you go to schools and classrooms around the world that they look a lot like the schools and classrooms in, the developed world or the global north or however we call it now, right? And so the knowledge generation and sharing is one way. And I think that the challenge for the field is how to make that two-way, right? How to not just what questions we need to be asking of our colleagues in other international contexts that help us better understand not just who we are, but then what leadership means in different contexts, and what are things that we don't think about because of, like you said, we're only in one system. And so this idea of how we learn from the knowledge bases in other cultures and contexts, to me, is a key part of this conversation.
yeah, so just as an example, so I've done a lot of work in Ghana, and I have quite a few colleagues in the Department of, I think it's called Educational Policy and Administration, or Planning and Administration. And they have a phenomenal department. It's one of the best on the African continent. They're preparing school leaders. In the early years, yes, they did look at other models. They did bring in particular from Cambridge, they brought in some people in ed leadership. And they still will invite people like me. But we're there having conversations, learning from each other.
Right. Right.
And it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
And when I was dean, at least then I had access to some resources, so I could bring some of those colleagues to our school. I brought colleagues from South Africa, from a variety of African nations, to share their learnings, their perceptions, their knowledge base with us.
Mm,
as a professor, you can't do those kinds of things very easily. There's no
mm,
there's no funding, and it's hard to rationalize that.
mm, mm,
Having said that, I live in Southern California. When I visit schools, how many of those children are
right.
recently arrived immigrants,
Mhm,
predominantly from Mexico, but all over Central America?
mhm,
If I were still a dean, I would be encouraging my colleagues, incentivizing them to look at the educational systems in
right.
Central America, in particular, and Mexico,
Mhm,
so that they can
right.
understand how to prepare
Mhm,
the teachers and administrators who are
right.
serving these children.
Yep. Yep. And that's such a powerful thing to think about, right? What, again, this idea of like, what kinds of questions do we need to be asking in order to deepen our own understanding, as opposed to, what we should be saying. Um, I guess maybe, trying to switch a little bit if we think about what the global is local or, what do you think UCA's role is in the future of sort of global leadership and preparation for a much more, fluid world that we live in now?
Well, Monica, I'm very excited about your international study tours. I think that's one great mechanism.
Mm.
Um, I would, and I know that I think you have a call recently to
Yep.
have people talk about, what are some other nations, because
Mm.
you've been to South Africa, Cuba, Egypt, maybe.
Yep. Yes.
Um, there aren't a lot of children in our schools from some of those countries.
Mm.
So I would hope that in the future,
Mm.
we would, it would be Mexico, for example.
Right.
We go to Mexico City,
Mm.
meet with the Ministry of Education folks there, talk
Mm.
about what their goals, dreams. They have an
Mm.
office that deals with all the kids along the border, and
Mm.
what those 5 states, the 5 Mexican states along the border, and how they are helping children as they are segueing maybe into our educational system or not. Um,
Mm.
so I think continuing those
Mm.
opportunities for faculty. The other thing that's really exciting is when I look at who's attending UCEA, and
Mm.
the color of the people who are in the rooms, the
Mm.
names of the faculty. I mean, there are faculty from all over the world,
Yeah.
and some of them are Americans, some of them are foreign citizens here for a shorter period of time, but
Mm.
they're bringing the perspectives to the table.
Mm.
I also think that continuing to partner with the other international organizations, and
Mm.
you're on the board, the advisory board of Global School Leaders. So somebody like them, they just put out that report on
Mhm.
women in the principalship around the world. You know, I don't know, but maybe that report being a focus of discussion at a
Mm.
session. Um,
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
because the foundations, like, they're not providing support to do this. The Longview Foundation was
Mhm.
doing some of that, and our faculty were able to write some grants to get some support, but there are very few foundations that are
Right.
incentivizing this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just to add what you're saying too, it's like, not just the number of faculty who are international scholars one way or the other, but also the number of graduate students that are also representing all corners of the world that are members of, that are students and UCA members, which is also a really, powerful kind of expansion of who of our demographic and what we look like and where our interests are. Um, Last question, Paula, and we're asking everyone this question. And of course, I could talk to you forever, but how has UCEA shaped you?
As a new professor, I found my tribe. I found people who were passionate about school leadership, and it didn't matter that if it wasn't international or not. They were just passionate about school leadership. So that was key. And I think the other part was, I was, I think, maybe about 38 when I became president, somewhere around there, and it just gave me a confidence sitting, going to being in the plenum, representing UConn there, and then sitting on the leadership, the UCEA leadership group, and being president. It just gave me confidence that I didn't have, and I felt respected by my colleagues, and I liked my colleagues. So, that's what UCEA can, and I see UCEA doing. I have several graduates that are UCEA faculty members of institutions that are UCEA members, and that's what UCEA does for them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think, that community is really, it's the past and the future, I think, in many ways, right? And we just sort of, we do our bit and we prepare the next generation and hope that they continue the work and continue to move into international and global contexts and be asking those kinds of questions that'll, hopefully improve, education around the world, but absolutely help us improve education here. So, Paula, thank you so much. It's been wonderful seeing you. I so appreciate your time. And, we'll have you back someday and talking about something else.
Thank you so much, Monica, and I'm delighted to see you, and UCEA is thriving, and that's what I care about. So thanks.
Thank you.